Previously in the North African Campaign series, we've seen the Italians advance into Egypt, only to be thrown back during Operation Compass, Britain's greatest forgotten victory of the war, which saw the British reach the El Agheila area. Rommel then landed in Africa and launched his first offensive, driving the British back to Tobruk and the Egyptian frontier. Failing to take Tobruk, Rommel resisted the British offensives of Operations Brevity and Battle Axe, but was driven back during Operation Crusader, the most insane battle ever. He fell back across Libya to the El Agheila area once again. Then Rommel launched his second offensive, forcing the British back to the Gazala line, where he defeated them in a tough battle that saw both sides lose a lot of tanks. The British retreated towards the Egyptian frontier, and Rommel then surrounded Tobruk for a second time, which he took after barely a day's worth of resistance. And now he aimed to cross the border into Egypt, which is where we are today. The fall of Tobruk shook us. That complacent feeling that all was going well with our army was gone. More than that, it had taken our confidence away. Worse still, many got panicky. The trucks were kept ready to move out at half an hour's notice, and then one night we were told to move back to the solemn box. Some elements of the Tobruk garrison continued to fight on until the 22nd, but the bulk of the resistance was over by the morning of the 21st. The British, now in a state of disarray, were positioned at the Egyptian frontier, hoping that Rommel would take his time and give them the opportunity to recover. But this was Rommel we're talking about, and the Axis now had enough captured British transport, fuel and ammunition to take them to Cairo. In fact, on this day, Fort Capuzzo fell to the Axis, netting them another 500 tons of fuel and 930 tons of provisions, in addition to the supplies captured at Tobruk and elsewhere. And knowing that a delay of a few days or a few weeks would permit the British to rebuild their strength, Rommel wanted to advance immediately. But there was a problem. Rommel knew that even with his captured stocks, the Axis supply lines wouldn't have the capacity to take them to Egypt, unless the British gave them next to no opposition. Well, due to American Colonel Bonner Fellers, who was in Cairo reporting on the situation, Rommel knew the dire state of the British forces opposing him. Colonel Bonner Fellers was delivering messages to the American government, but the American codes had been stolen by the Italians, and so the Axis were listening in on his reports. Well, because the British were on their knees, Colonel Bonner Fellers reported, "If Rommel intends to take the Delta, now is the time," and that such an opportunity may never come again. So Rommel had read Fellers' report, and despite the supply problems, he decided to gamble and race to the Nile. If we could succeed in destroying the tattered remnants of the 8th Army, which had escaped from the Mamaraka battles, plus its 2 fresh divisions, and this was by no means impossible, then the British would have nothing left in Egypt capable of opposing our advance to Alexandria and the Suez Canal. This was in opposition to the previously agreed upon plan that after the capture of Tobruk, the Panzer Army would stop for 6 weeks to rest. And they really needed that rest, since the Afrika Korps was exhausted and chronically short of fuel and panzers. We'll come back to discuss the numbers shortly, but even with his weakened forces, Rommel believed he had a chance. Soldiers of the Panzer Army Africa, now for the complete destruction of the enemy. We will not rest until we have shattered the last remnants of the British 8th Army. During the days to come, I shall call on you for one more great effort to bring us to this final goal. On the other side, the British 8th Army was at the Egyptian border in a bunch of defensive boxes, most of which were incomplete. And these could easily be outflanked via the open desert to the south, since the British now didn't have enough armour to stop Rommel. To make matters worse, General Pienaar of the 1st South African Division informed 8th Army's General Staff Officer, Brigadier Whiteley, that he simply didn't have enough men to hold his position at the kennels. Ritchie decided that Pienaar's 1st South African Division was not up to scratch, that it needed retraining, and decided to withdraw it and reform it at El Alamein.
This would leave Ritchie with Gott's 13th Corps, consisting of the battered 7th Armoured Division, now just 3 armoured battalions strong, the weakened 10th Indian Division, and the British 50th Division. There were another 5 armoured car battalions, but otherwise this was a weak force overall to attempt to hold the Egyptian frontier with. However, when Rees of the 10th Indian Division also informed his corps commander, General Gott, that his battered division wasn't capable of holding his box either, since his units had only just survived the Battle of Gazala, Gott sacked Rees on the spot. This was uncharacteristic of Gott, and Nash speculates that this talk with Rees must have followed from a more disagreeable joust with Pienaar, but it just shows that had Pienaar truly been under British command like the Indian Army was, then he probably would have been sacked too. But Pienaar wasn't, and so Pienaar remained. Gott had also lost confidence in his armoured forces, most of which were now mixtures of various different units, and cohesion had been lost, morale was low, and the troops themselves were exhausted.
We crossed the wire this morning and are now fighting on Egyptian soil. All our armour seems to have fallen back, leaving just our columns up here. Our main problem now is a lack of sleep. Just a couple of hours each day is all we can get, and everyone is extremely tired.
Therefore, on the 21st of June 1942, Ritchie reported to the commanders-in-chief that his best option was to delay the Axis at the Egyptian border while the bulk of his forces withdrew to the Mersa Matruh positions. As there were no natural defences between the border and the Mersa Matruh area, they all agreed that this was the best plan. And it was helped by the fact that water was scarce in the 120 miles between the frontier and Matruh, which the British knew would cause Rommel significant logistical issues. There was a downside, however. Withdrawing to Matruh would allow the Axis Air Force to hit the Nile Delta and the Suez Canal and even the Red Sea. It would also prevent the Desert Air Force from striking most of the Axis ports, and they couldn't cover convoys going to Malta from Egypt. Malta would be further isolated, Axis supplies would increase, and it was even possible that Turkey might change her stance in favour of the Axis. But what choice did they have? Auchinleck, Commander-in-Chief of the Middle East, visited Ritchie on the 22nd of June 1942 and wasn't happy with the idea of falling back to Matruh. If they didn't have enough armour to hold the frontier, what made him think that they would have enough at Matruh?
The weakness of the plan was that at Matruh, no less than on the frontier, a strong armoured reserve was needed for an active defence. Unless the enemy was appreciably delayed on the frontier, this strong armoured reserve would not exist.
The debate over whether they should have fought at the frontier, fell back or retreated further raged at the time and has raged ever since. Ritchie had made the decision not to stand at the frontier, but to delay Rommel for a time, then fall back to Mersa Matruh. And while this was the right decision in hindsight, the major flaw was that they had underestimated the Axis ability to supply their forces. The author of the official British history, Major General Ian Playfair, comments that the decision to stand at Matruh was a mistake. He says that the British should have made a full withdrawal all the way back to El Alamein, as the defensive potential there was better, and Rommel's logistics would have been stretched. The reason they didn't do this was because they couldn't just permit Rommel to drive all the way to the doorstep of the Nile Delta without making any attempt to stop him. In an attempt to create mobile forces, General Ritchie ordered that the British divisions be split up into 2 sections. The first would be a static unit that would occupy the frontier positions, while the second element would be turned into mobile columns of infantry and artillery. These mobile units would be called brigade battle groups. There wasn't enough time to implement this order on the frontier, but this reorganisation would become important later. And behind the scenes, Auchinleck was planning to sack many of his commanders and had already informed Churchill that Ritchie and Norrie were going to be relieved as soon as was feasible. It's not clear if Auchinleck was the catalyst for this or if Churchill was. At the time, Churchill was with Alanbrooke and President Roosevelt in the White House discussing whether or not to relieve Ritchie. Alanbrooke said he was devoted to Ritchie but felt that it was about time to relieve him of command.
He should have done this when I asked him to in May. Ritchie had been an unfortunate choice as army commander, though he was later to become a successful corps commander under Montgomery in northwest Europe. In the desert, moreover, he had been placed in a singularly difficult position by his commander-in-chief. His original appointment at a critical stage in Crusader was understandable as a temporary measure, but his subsequent retention had unfortunate consequences for which Auchinleck must share the blame.
Rommel had allowed his troops to rest in the evening of the 21st, and now ordered them east on the 22nd, with Rommel himself entering Bardia. To rest and relax, the men of the 361st Motorised Regiment went for a swim, but Rommel intervened and instead ordered them to advance to Mersa Matruh, which was 156 miles away. They wouldn't be allowed to rest because Egypt had to be taken. On the 23rd of June 1942, Hitler received a message from Rommel that said he could reach the Suez Canal if he had his Führer's go-ahead. Hitler had never been keen on taking Malta, thinking that the island wasn't worth it, especially since he had assumed the Italians wouldn't be much help in that operation. In fact, on the 15th of June, he had told Admiral Raeder that he had decided to postpone the attack on the island indefinitely, and Hitler now told Mussolini and Raeder that they could just suppress it from the air and then capture the island after the fall of the Suez Canal. So, paradoxically, Rommel's success at Tobruk saved Malta because it convinced Hitler that there was no need to take the island. But even though Malta was suppressed, Axis logistics were strained. In fact, instead of the requirement of 60,000 tons for his Panzer Army in June 1942, Rommel would only receive 3,000 tons. So Rommel really shouldn't have been able to advance into Egypt. But because Rommel had captured so many British trucks and tons of British supplies, plus the fact that the Axis units were stripped back to the very bone, meant that they could roll the dice. Rommel was, in essence, driving into Egypt with British trucks running on British petrol. And stripped back they were. It's not known precisely, but it's thought that the 15th Panzer Division only had either 14, 18 or 20 panzers left, while the 21st Panzer Division had 30. So a total of 44 panzers, but possibly 50. Worse, of the remaining panzers, perhaps a third were Mark IIs and command tanks. They also only had about 1,500 grenadiers in their two depleted panzer divisions, and the 90th Light Division also only had another 1,000 men, although some sources say they had 1,600. So the Germans had, at most, 3,100 infantrymen in their entire army, and 44 or so panzers. This is in comparison to the 332 panzers they had had prior to Gazala, meaning that they were at about 13% of their former strength. The veteran Ariete Armoured and Trieste Motorised Divisions, the original two Italian mobile divisions, also only had 14 tanks left, mostly M13s. They had 30 guns and about 2,000 infantrymen in total. Now, they had just received the Littorio Armoured Division, but due to fuel shortages and lack of transport, most of the Italian infantry had been left behind. And so even with this new division, the Italians only had about 6,000 infantry and 70 tanks. The Brescia division boasted about 500 infantrymen, which is about the number you'd expect to see in a battalion. Clearly, with the Italians so weak, the German Afrika Korps would have to do the majority of the fighting. And while the Littorio was the new armoured division on the scene, it was Italian, so it had weak tanks and it could hardly be classed as fresh.
Although the Littorio division had been in North Africa since January 1942, it had been continuously stripped of personnel and equipment to replace losses in the Ariete and Trieste divisions. Even when committed to the front in June, the Littorio Division only had a single medium tank battalion and was still deficient in support units. The troops in the division were relatively inexperienced, but its division commander, General Gervasio Bertossi, was one of the most experienced armoured leaders in the Regio Esercito.
The Axis had a total of 421 aircraft and could theoretically call upon more from the rest of the Mediterranean, bringing the grand total to 1,095. However, these numbers are irrelevant, as we'll come to understand shortly, so we'll put an asterisk beside them now. At the Egyptian frontier, immediately after Gazala and Tobruk, the British didn't have the numbers that I'm about to give you. They definitely had less. But for the coming battle that would happen in a few days' time, these were the numbers that they would have, and I want to give them to you now so you can see them side by side with the Axis. So, for the coming battle, the British would have about 20,000 frontline infantrymen, more than double the Axis number, and 159 cruiser tanks, which wasn't much more than the Axis. The 60 Grant tanks they had were better than anything the Italians had, and somewhat better than the German Panzer IIIs, but the 19 infantry tanks that were supporting the infantry divisions were significantly out of date now. So while the grand total of British tanks was 174, the fact that they only had a slight numerical tank advantage here meant that they were in trouble, especially considering that they had had double the amount of tanks than the Axis at Gazala and had still lost that battle. The Desert Air Force had 463 aircraft, with another 420 in the Middle East, which could theoretically be called upon, bringing the grand total to 883 for the British. So in the desert itself, the British had a slight numerical superiority in the air, but if both sides called upon their reserves, the Axis would have more. Again, the asterisk remains on the Axis number. But, as I said, the British were weaker than this when they were at the Egyptian border, which is why Gott's forces simply started retreating when Rommel crossed over the frontier that evening, taking advantage of the moonlight. He drove south of all the defensive positions, and the British simply abandoned the plan to try and delay the Axis. 7th Armoured Division fled towards Mersa Matruh, although it's not clear who gave this order. The 1st South African Division scarpered back towards El Alamein, and the British mined Solem's harbour and destroyed its port. From this point onwards, Rommel met very little opposition from the British on the ground, but air attacks did take their toll. Rommel didn't want to give the British any rest, as he knew that they would recover if he let them, so he had to keep on attacking. That evening, the 90th Light Division ran into a British column, and the 21st Panzer Division ran into the 3rd Indian Brigade, with both units being routed.
This was a period of uncertainty and distress, at once mental and physical. Men woke to the sound of exploding bombs. At night, scares were frequent. Enemy flares dropped to illuminate the darkness were particularly unnerving. At any moment, the cry might come, "The enemy is upon us!" Staff officers began to shout irritably down their telephones. Many were the narrow squeaks and close shaves during this month of retreat. Few were not in a high state of nerves, but they did their best to look unconcerned and to set a good example to their fellows. Journeys became as terrible as nightmares and most perilous. Trucks were often without food and water, even reserve rations had been finished or abandoned. How often did men groan or curse at the slowness of the vehicle in front of them in a convoy driving towards Egypt? How frequent were the outbursts of impatience? Everyone tremendously depressed, almost impossible to get any enthusiasm.
The British were hastily forming a defence at Mersa Matruh, with Holmes's 10th Corps moving in to occupy Matruh itself. General William Holmes was a very experienced general, with more experience than both Ritchie and Auchinleck, and so this was a welcome reinforcement. The plan was for Gott's 13th Corps to occupy Sidi Hamza, and Norrie's 30th Corps would collect and form an armoured reserve at El Alamein. But the speed of Rommel's advance meant that preparations were rushed. 10th Corps only started relieving the 30th Corps at Mersa Matruh on the 23rd. and the 2nd New Zealand Division was being brought up to the front but was being slowed down by the copious amounts of vehicles fleeing from the west, estimated at 750 per hour, including those of the 1st South African Division.
The perverse, porky humour of the British soldier who, in times of stress, finds an outlet for his feelings in the Cockney habit of delighting in the worst possible news and humour. "You are going the wrong way, chum," was typical in the greetings given the division as it moved forwards. To the fresh, physically fit New Zealanders, the greeting was more irritating than humorous.
General Freyberg of the New Zealand Division had decided to write up a report on what had caused the British loss at Gazala and Tobruk. This was only intended for the New Zealand officers, not the British Army as a whole, but when Auchinleck got word of it, he demanded that he see it and review it before it got sent out.
Freyberg foresaw correctly that this was an attempt to interfere with his ideas about fighting as a division in favour of Auchinleck's brigade group's theory.
Then, when they finally did arrive at Matruh, General Freyberg from the 2nd New Zealand Division complained about the placement of his division in the Matruh box. The first reason was because the defences at Matruh were inadequate. From 1940 onwards, the British had slowly prepared the Matruh defences, and so there was an anti-tank ditch, lots of minefields, barbed wire and bunkers in the Charing Cross area, but General Holmes described them as only being partially prepared, and Brigadier Kippenberger of the 5th New Zealand Brigade said they were in very bad order, with minefields poorly marked, the wire was on the ground, communications non-existent, and the plan for the defence obscure. But worse, between Charing Cross and the southern escarpment, the defences were especially weak, with only a thin layer of mines, and then the defences stopped there. Beyond that, the desert flank was wide open. It was obvious that Rommel would easily go around the flank, and so Freyberg protested to both Holmes and Ritchie, saying that he refused to allow his forces to be split up into useless penny packets or get surrounded in the box at Matruh.
He regarded box defences as traps in which isolated defenders were overrun by the enemy at his convenience. He also doubted whether, in the prevailing circumstances, Matruh could be held.
Deciding the issue for them, Freyberg invoked his special charter with the New Zealand government that said that he had the right to pull his forces out, and so they transferred his division to the 13th Corps. At first, he was asked to occupy the Sidi Hamza area, but refused that position too. So instead, Freyberg started to move his division to the area known as Minqar Qaim, as the 10th Indian Division replaced them at Mersa Matruh itself. Yet, despite insisting that his division be kept together, Freyberg only had 2 of his 3 New Zealand brigades at the front. The 3rd Brigade had been left behind at El Alamein as it hadn't received enough transport, so Freyberg's command was weakened anyway, and the position at Minqar Qaim was an odd one. The escarpment would prevent enemy tanks from moving north to south, but the enemy was coming from the west. Freyberg and his commanders knew that their position could easily be cut off unless the British armour prevented them from being surrounded. Well, since the 159 tanks of 1st Armoured Division were in the open desert to the southwest of Matruh, having been reinforced by 7th Armoured Division's armoured brigades, the New Zealanders believed that they were protected. But this was not the case. The British troops that flooded back to the Mersa Matruh positions were in a disorganised mess. Most of them weren't really fighting units anymore, just muddled blobs of men and equipment that some officers called a rabble or flotsam and jetsam.
Orders and counter-orders, marches and counter-marches, works started and stopped, were seen by other ranks and many officers only as evidence of the apparent inability of higher formations to make up their minds what was to be done. Even in divisional headquarters, the rapid changes from command to command, although provided for in the plans, were bewildering.
And the overall disposition of British forces left a lot to be desired. Just like the New Zealand Division was short 1 brigade, none of the other British divisions were complete units either. The 5th and 10th Indian and British 50th Divisions all kept one brigade group forward with their divisional headquarters and artillery, while the other brigade from each division was at El Alamein. To make things worse, the 50th Division hadn't received replacement for the equipment they'd left behind at Gazala, and the 10th Indian Division had been battered previously. But perhaps the most ridiculous decision in this battle was the splitting up of the already depleted 29th Indian Infantry Brigade, the only brigade in the 5th Indian Division, into penny packets, then spreading these out between Charing Cross and the escarpment near Sidi Hamza. This weak brigade only had 2 battalions because the 3rd had been destroyed at point 650 near Tobruk, and rather than keep these 2 battalions together, they were divided into 6 small sections, 4 of which consisted of 2 companies of infantry backed by 1 battery each of artillery and anti-tank guns. These lined the southern escarpment west of the New Zealanders. The other 2 units, Glee Col and Leather Col, only had 2 platoons of infantry and were expected to cover the 9-mile-wide central position of the entire British front. There was nobody else, it was just them.
Ritchie's dispositions at Mersa Matruh were unimaginative, leaving a large 20-kilometre-mile gap in the middle between his 2 corps and scattering infantry and artillery in small packets.
The overall idea was that Rommel would be held in front of Mersa Matruh and Sidi Hamza, somehow, and 13th Corps would counterattack whatever or whenever Rommel attacked. So if he did smash through the central defences, the British would counter there, or if he swept around to the south, the British would strike back there too. Essentially, this was the Gazala plan all over again. The Axis captured some petrol at Habata, but it took them time to redistribute it, and so the Axis armour and motorised units were immobilised for most of the day on the 24th of June due to a lack of fuel. The Luftwaffe was at Gambut, an airfield that was so far away that Rommel had no air support at all, and started to feel the pinch of the Desert Air Force, who launched 102 sorties against them. So this is why I put an asterisk next to the Axis aircraft numbers before. Even though the Axis had more planes, they weren't able to use them to cover Rommel, meaning that the British had almost total dominance of the skies.
Rommel never again enjoyed the advantage of air superiority, and the enemy's air forces grew with terrifying strength. It was the beginning of a process which was to alter the whole balance of the war, and which reached its culmination in the annihilating battles of Mortain and Falaise.
Still, Rommel insisted that they advance, and therefore, even when the main body of the units were halted, detachments were sent forward to maintain the momentum. They moved over 100 miles on this day, and by the evening had reached the coast between Sidi Barrani and Mersa Matruh. It was at this point, on the 24th of June 1942, that Hitler and Mussolini gave Rommel permission to advance east of the Egyptian border. Better late than never, but at least he had formal approval from above now.
Kesselring was therefore wasting his time when he signalled Hitler to request Rommel be halted and for Hercules to be carried out as originally planned. He warned with abundant and forceful truth that the Luftwaffe was temporarily exhausted and could not give adequate cover for the long-range drive Rommel intended. He said too that, with Malta already resurgent and supplies at a premium, despite the acquisitions in Tobruk, there would be a logistic breakdown. He called the scheme madness. Hitler brusquely replied with a direct order to give maximum support. Malta had already started to recover and was once again threatening to cut Axis supply lines. 2 Axis cargo ships had just been sunk, and it was necessary to recall most of the Luftwaffe units in Africa to deal with Malta. Not that they could support Rommel anyway, but there were even less planes for him now. Looking back, it seems understandable that Rommel, as a field commander, should wish to remain on the heels of a fleeing enemy. But the Supreme Commander, or rather Hitler, should have appreciated the strategic importance of Malta and its defensive significance in the Mediterranean. It was for the Supreme Command to assert itself on a strategic question and to refuse to allow an advance to the Suez Canal until Malta had been taken. Thus we lost a great opportunity of capturing the island, which had been so hammered by the Luftwaffe that the chances of success were very promising.
On the 25th of June 1942, Cavallero arrived in Africa and spoke to Kesselring, Admiral Weichold, and other Italian officers at Derna. Kesselring still believed that taking on Malta was the correct course of action, but could see the advantages of chasing the British and giving them no rest. So he therefore compromised by saying it was alright for Rommel to strike east, but that he didn't think they could go beyond the El Alamein area. Well, Rommel was certainly going to try. In the morning, the 90th Light Division was less than 30 kilometers from Matruh, with the rest of the Panzer Army not far behind. And despite the Desert Air Force's attempt at interdiction, German reconnaissance battalions reached the Matruh defences that afternoon. Rommel decided, for the next day, to launch a hasty attack against the British positions ahead of him, but British bombers continued to drop bombs overnight, especially on the Italians, who reported that the bombs fell uninterrupted all night after 10:30 PM.
At 09:15 hours, welcomed with great joy, the first German fighters appear. The damage from the air might well have been worse, but for an unusual aspect of this phase of the campaign. Rommel had so many British vehicles in his army by now, perhaps as many as 85% of his trucks, that British bombers often mistook his columns for friendlies and spared them. The last British train left Mersa Matruh on this day, and I believe this picture is that train, so I thought I'd show it now. So, these were the positions of the units on the eve of the Battle of Mersa Matruh. Both sides had their advantages and disadvantages, and so it's difficult to determine if either side was truly superior to the other. But the one thing that the Axis side had was a determined commander. Ritchie and Auchinleck were not so determined to hold this place. After watching Ritchie deploy the 8th Army for 3 days and acquiescing to his decision to make a stand there, Auchinleck panicked and suddenly realised that the 8th Army risked being surrounded at Mersa Matruh.
So, Auchinleck finally took action. During Operation Crusader, Auchinleck had appointed Ritchie, a battle Ritchie had won, and because of this, Auchinleck felt that he couldn't remove Ritchie, since he was the hero of Crusader. But the disastrous losses at Gazala and Tobruk, coupled with the fact that Ritchie had been unwilling to make a stand at the frontier, gave Auchinleck the excuse he needed to get rid of him. And the question was, who would be the person to replace him? Auchinleck had been tempted to take command of the 8th Army previously, and Churchill had even suggested it. But his main command was the Middle East, of which the 8th Army was only one part. So just like Wavell previously, Auchinleck didn't think an army group commander could focus entirely on just one of his many armies. Yet, the circumstances in Egypt dictated that he had to, because if he didn't, Rommel may just get what he wanted, the Suez Canal. It hadn't made sense to have the army group commander command one army previously, even though Rommel did it all the time. But now that the Axis were racing into Egypt after their victories at Gazala and Tobruk, it wouldn't be right to place another subordinate in command, so Auchinleck had to do it himself. Therefore, after a magnificent lunch at the Muhammad Ali Club in Cairo, Auchinleck flew to Matan Bagush with Major General Eric Dorman Smith, and there, on the evening of the 25th of June 1942, the night before the Battle of Mersa Matruh, Auchinleck relieved Ritchie of command of the 8th Army.
I told Ritchie that the situation was such that nobody but I could be saddled with the responsibility, and that therefore I was taking over from him. Ritchie took the news calmly. Did he not take everything calmly? There was no tension, no recrimination. The efficient staff officer once again, Ritchie described what he knew of the situation, which, in Auchinleck's words, wasn't much. Ritchie had struggled manfully to please Auchinleck, but he never dominated either his subordinates or the battlefield. He was an honourable man, picked to do the wrong job at the wrong time, and probably for the wrong reasons. He had been unfailingly loyal to Auchinleck, who had repaid him with a different coin. After the war, Auchinleck ruthlessly savaged Ritchie's reputation in order to salvage his own. That last part is important. Auchinleck tried to paint himself out of the picture so as to pin the blame on his subordinates, and his reputation has largely been maintained to this day. However, historians are starting to see the blatantly obvious cracks in the defence, and now questions are being raised about Auchinleck's conduct during Gazala, Tobruk, and now Mersa Matruh too. We'll discuss this going forward, so it's worth bearing in mind. So Auchinleck was 8th Army's new commander, and he informed Whitehall that he intended to use Dorman Smith as his Chief of Staff, a controversial appointment as Dorman Smith was considered to be unsound by the British Army, and his appointment caused an argument that lasted a long time. Auchinleck and his Deputy Chief of Staff, Dorman Smith, were appalled when they received details of Ritchie's dispositions at Mersa Matruh, which left huge gaps open through which Rommel could drive and force him to fight on a reversed front. The British had 2 strong flanks with hardly any forces deployed in the centre at all, other than a thin minefield. It is still difficult to know exactly what the British intended here, and in fact the bundled deployment is only explainable as an example of the confusion then reigning in the British command. At first, Auchinleck intended to fight. He ordered that when the Axis did attack, all artillery should be brought to bear upon them, and counterattacks by nearby divisions should go in to hit them on the front and the flanks, coordinated by the corps commanders. But realistically, Auchinleck knew that without adequate armoured support, Matruh was just as indefensible as the frontier, since the Axis could definitely penetrate the minefields in the area if they didn't just go around them. So realising that Rommel could pierce his centre and destroy him piecemeal like they had at Gazala, Auchinleck changed his plan just before midnight on the 25th of June 1942. His intention now was to not make a final stand at Mersa Matruh. Instead, he would fall back and fight the Axis between Matruh and the Alamein positions. On the very eve of battle, when the enemy was making his dispositions to close on the outposts, General Auchinleck took personal command of 8th Army and completely changed the plans for the battle. I decided to keep the 8th Army fully mobile, and to bring the enemy's advance to a halt in the area between Matruh, El Alamein and the Qattara Depression. In no circumstances was any part of the 8th Army to be allowed to be shut up in Matruh, even if this involved abandoning the position entirely. But Auchinleck did not manage to get an order out to this effect to his subordinates until 04:15 hours on the 26th of June. By this point, with enemy forces already on the horizon, it was too late to make any major deployment modifications, and Auchinleck's precipitate action only added further confusion to an already unsettled 8th Army. I aim to keep all troops fluid and mobile, and strike at the enemy from all sides, armour not to be committed unless a very favourable opportunity presents itself. At all costs, and even if ground has to be given up, I intend to keep 8th Army in being, and to give no hostage to fortune in the shape of immobile troops holding localities which can easily be isolated. But when both Auchinleck and Dorman Smith ordered their units to fight as mobile brigade groups, just like Ritchie had, a problem emerged. Due to the current disorganisation and lack of transport, it was impossible for the units to form proper brigade groups, and so the impression that the division and brigade commanders got was that the era of the smaller jock column had come again. That's right, the British would, once more, split their units up into useless penny packets to be destroyed piecemeal by Rommel. To this objection, the same reply could be given, that the Panzer Army fought most of its actions with battle groups, often hastily improvised in the field. But once again, the lack of specific training of the British junior officers, and still more the absence of clear-cut objectives and of close and coordinating control, were likely to prove disastrous.
But the British weren't trained in mission-orientated tactics like the Germans were, and jot columns weren't the same as the German Kampfgruppen, which tended to be larger. Worse, the men weren't sure what to do because the orders they received were contradictory. Both 10th Indian and British 50th Divisions were now simultaneously trying to dig in at the static defences, whilst making themselves mobile to conform to Auchinleck's new tactics, while also under imminent threat of attack. Plus, there was no real line, the units were split up and dotted all over the place, and signal communications were bad. The formations didn't know who their neighbours were or what they were supposed to be doing. It was just obvious that the British weren't going to do well in this battle.
Brigadier Walsh, Brigadier General Staff of 10th Corps, was good. In his notes he said on that day, I think about the 23rd or 24th of June, his corps got 3 separate sets of orders, all of them altering the policy of defence. Ironically, the anger the men felt towards their superiors actually boosted their willingness to fight, and this was bolstered still further when they heard that Ritchie had been sacked. Perhaps now things might get better, they thought. Still, British morale was nearing rock bottom, especially in their tank forces, and they were exhausted, much like the Germans. Everyone was dirty, tired, and uncomfortable. Colonel Willy Tiger, the commander of the 8th Panzer Regiment, for example, had not slept for 4 days. On June 26th he remarked, "My panzers are like me, at the end of my tether." He did not intend Erwin Rommel to hear that comment, but he did. "We are not here to give the enemy time for rest." Rommel was very short-tempered during this period. His health was not robust. He was physically worn out. Men less than half his age were collapsing due to exhaustion, and he was under enormous pressure and stress, all of which exasperated his natural impatience. To add to this stress, on the 26th of June 1942, Cavallero, Bastico and Kesselring went to see Rommel. This meeting was ironically known as the Meeting of the Field Marshals, because when Hitler promoted Rommel, Mussolini, not to be outdone, elevated both Cavallero and Bastico to the same rank, prompting Ciano to remark that while the first appointment amused people, the second made them indignant. Cavallero said that he had to be promoted because he had found himself between Rommel and Kesselring like Christ between the thieves. Cavallero warned Rommel that Malta had resumed its offensive role, and so shipments to Tripoli would have to stop entirely, while shipments to Tobruk and other ports were also threatened. Thus, supplies would become short again, and operations beyond the El Alamein positions could only be considered once the situation with Malta was resolved. Rommel was not interested in stopping artificially. If the British stopped him, well, fair enough, but he explained that they were in no position to do so. He said he was about to take Mersa Matruh, then Al Dabba, after which he would take Alexandria or Cairo. He thought they would fall on the 30th, in just 4 days' time, after which they would take the all-important Suez Canal. On the following day, Cavallero conceded that if the enemy were on the run, the advance should continue. Cavallero was more or less on Rommel's side, but Kesselring was against any further advance. Ultimately, though, the decision lay with Rommel, and I need to point out that in early histories, the narrative said that Kesselring was all for the advance on the Nile, and that he, as the quartermaster for the Panzer Army, was criminally optimistic in his ability to supply its advance. For example, Schmidt in With Rommel in the Desert even says that Kesselring had promised all supply problems would be solved and that therefore the logistics of an advance into Egypt were safe.
But Maxey, in his biography of Kesselring, points out that this view came from the veterans of the army like Schmidt, who blamed Kesselring for what happened, not from Kesselring himself. And Kesselring denied that he had been an advocate for the advance. Rommel also did not say that Kesselring had been for the advance, and said he could only offer protection for the sea convoys via the air. Instead, Rommel blamed the Italians for not doing more to support them, although it was the overall Axis fuel shortage which was the real culprit here. In practice, Kesselring could only do his best as a glorified quartermaster to remedy a situation over which he had been deprived of operational control. His energetic and continuous efforts to move supplies from Europe to the front were foredoomed to failure. He was unaware that every convoy that sailed was notified to the British by Ultra, so that only a trickle of supplies got through the British air and sea blockade. So, with Rommel ultimately the one in charge, this battle was going to happen. But Rommel didn't know where all the British units were. He thought that the minefields were strong, that the 1st Armoured Division was in the centre, and that all the British infantry, including the New Zealanders, were at Matruh. So Rommel employed a very simple tactic. They would penetrate the centre of the British line, race to the coast to cut Matruh off, then destroy the pocket. To do this, the Panzer divisions would chase away the British armour, the 90th Light Division would be the one to reach the coast, and the Italians would lock the British in the pocket. Well, during the first half of the day, the Axis prepared their units for the upcoming attack, being hit by British bombers as they did so. That was until German fighters appeared in the afternoon, bombing the New Zealanders at Minqar Qaim and causing 62 casualties. 4 Axis bombers were taken down for the loss of 12 British aircraft on this day. However, a major success was achieved by the British when their bombers struck the Italian 20th Corps headquarters, killing the Corps commander and 2 of his officers. This loss of leadership may help explain why the Italian 20th Corps was ineffective during this advance. Then, at either 3:30 or 4 PM on the 26th of June 1942, the advance began. At 5 PM, Rommel's units reached the British centre, and von Mellenthin said it was purely by chance that they had picked the weakest part of the British line to attack, even though the entire line was weak, so it wouldn't have mattered too much where they had attacked. All that stood before them was Leathercol and Gleecol, the 2 weakest units in the entire 8th Army. So the 90th Light Division quickly annihilated Leathercol, taking 400 prisoners in a swift action before getting stuck on the minefields for some time, where they were hit hard by the Indian artillery. Gleecol was also smashed by the 21st Panzer Division, which suffered 8 panzers damaged in return, mainly due to mines. 21st Panzer Division was halted by the subsidiary minefield behind the 1st, where they formed a hedgehog and began to carve gaps in them. An intelligence summary from British 13th Corps, however, noted that the Germans were simply passing through the minefield without bothering to look for gaps, and that the mines were failing to explode. Below these actions, 15th Panzer Division, with the Italian 20th Corps even further south, advanced rapidly against minor resistance from the tankless 7th Motor Brigade, but then stopped when they reached the sewer track. Here, the first day's attack came to a halt, more or less in a line, without the British tanks doing anything to intervene. We contacted the enemy this morning and had a few hours lead slinging. When dawn broke, there was about 500 vehicles and guns a couple of hundred yards away from us. We fired the first shot and all hell broke loose for a while. I think we came off best in that sortie, knocking out some guns and tanks. The tanks of the 1st Armoured Division, upon whom the outcome of the battle depended, spent the day by Gott's orders so far out of touch to the south of Sidi Hamza that they did not even meet Rommel's fainting force, 15th Panzer Division. Due to conflicting reports and poor communications with the 29th Indian Infantry Brigade, the British command didn't fully understand what had happened. One report from Gleecol even said that 100 panzers had broken through their lines, perhaps because they mistook the German trucks for tanks. The remaining parts of 29th Indian Brigade were withdrawn under Stuka attack into the reserve, but as Barry Pitt explains in his excellent Crucible of War series, the Axis advance had presented the British with a fantastic opportunity. The bulk of Rommel's forces were right there, in the heart of their lines, with maybe 16 Panzer IIIs just sitting there in the open. Had the British got their act together, their two corps, with 60 Grant tanks and a bunch of other tanks, supported by the excellent New Zealand Division and elements from 10th Corps, could have concentrated and annihilated the Axis in the centre.
Unfortunately, as a result of Auchinleck's new policy, everybody assumed that withdrawal was planned. Already, too many people were looking over their shoulders.
So the opportunity was squandered. In fact, only one unit bothered to do anything. Overnight, Percy's 9th Durham's Battalion moved to the area behind where Leathercoll had been in a vain attempt to plug the gap. Unfortunately, the rock in this area prevented them from digging in, and they had no mines either. So, at dawn, under a hail of artillery fire from the 50th Division, the 90th Light Division rolled through the gaps they'd carved in the minefields and ran straight into this lone battalion, annihilating them. Special note must be made of the one 6-pounder gunner who lost his arm but kept fighting. He somehow managed to reload his gun and damage an enemy tank before he was blown to pieces. This not only shows that the British soldier was willing to fight, but that their leadership were awfully keen on throwing their men away in useless penny packets with no prospect of victory. Further artillery fire prevented the 90th Light Division from continuing, and so they withdrew south to lay low for a while. Meanwhile, the 21st Panzer and Littorio divisions moved east, as did the 15th Panzer Division and the Italian 20th Corps. The 4th and 22nd Armoured Brigades plus the 7th Motor Brigade held the 15th Panzer Division back, and the Italians, having just lost their commanders, couldn't keep up. So the British actually had the 15th Panzer Division isolated between two armoured brigades who had almost 10 times as many tanks as they did. Of course, the Germans employed their combined arms tactics with 88s, Panzers and tank hunters deployed to stem the tide, and they managed to knock out 5 Grant tanks and 3 Valentines for the loss of 5 Panzer IIIs and several anti-tank guns. Even when the Italians did eventually catch up, the British continued to hold their own. And Rommel was at the front in the centre, and thinking that the units opposing 15th Panzer Division would need to escape down the passage at Minqar Qaim, he ordered the 21st Panzer Division to move to the area north of there to cut off their retreat. It's worth noting that he was still unaware that the New Zealanders were at Minqar Qaim, and so it was a bit of a surprise when at 10 AM the 21st Panzer Division ran into the transport units of the 4th and 5th New Zealand Infantry Brigades. Some of these scarpered east, but more fled south in a semicircle to seek refuge with the bulk of the division. An artillery duel then opened up between the two divisions, with German shells mostly falling on the New Zealand Divisional Headquarters, killing 5 of their staff and wounding several more. General Gott was with the New Zealand Division from 11 AM and saw the situation unfolding. He was aware of the report made by 29th Indian Infantry Brigade saying that they saw over 100 panzers, although the New Zealanders themselves estimated that 21st Panzer Division only had 15 tanks, which was almost true. They had 16 Mark IIIs and 5 Mark IIs, 21 in total. Then, at 11:20 AM, Auchinleck sent a message to Gott and Holmes telling them that, if necessary and on the receipt of the code word Pike, both corps should disengage and withdraw to a line from YouTube censorship location to Minqar Omar. And yes, there is a place on the map with that name. And no, there's no way I can get away with saying that on this platform. For Auchinleck, this was just a precautionary arrangement in case the battle turned against them. But considering that everyone was looking over their shoulders anyway, it's probable that the commanders like Gott and Lumsden misinterpreted this to mean that a withdrawal was seriously being considered. It really shouldn't have been though. Had Auchinleck been fully informed and accurately aware of the situation, he would have seen that the 15th Panzer Division was in a dire state. If properly employed, the 1st Armoured Division could have destroyed them all. But he didn't know, like we do now, what the Axis tank numbers were, and so it wasn't to be. At noon, with the 15th Panzer Division still held up and the Italian 20th Corps unable to help them, the Afrika Korps ordered the 21st Panzer Division to attack Minqar Qaim directly. 21st Panzer Division attempted to do so, but with its inadequate forces facing determined New Zealand opposition, it could only report that it needed support against what it called stubborn resistance. With enemy panzers roaming about, at 12:30 PM, Freyberg asked Gott if he could have some infantry tanks as support. Gott refused this, saying he wanted to keep his armour concentrated as ordered by Auchinleck, and that's a fair assessment. But Gott did ring Brigadier Whiteley at 8th Army headquarters to report that the 2nd New Zealand Division was being shelled heavily, and that he had given Freyberg permission to sidestep if necessary, since Minqar Qaim was not that important in the grand scheme of things. Brigadier Whiteley replied that they would arrange for Holmes's 10th Corps to strike south to relieve the pressure on the New Zealanders. This is an odd change of tactics because 13th Corps was meant to have been counterattacking to help 10th Corps, not the other way around. Holmes was therefore ordered to send the 50th Division to seize part of the northern escarpment, and the 5th Indian Infantry Brigade was ordered to try and take the escarpment further west overnight. But the attack would only start in 7 hours' time at 7:30 PM, and so the New Zealanders were effectively on their own until then. Now, this is where several events all happen at once, and the primary sources aren't exactly clear, which makes piecing this together a bit difficult. Some historians definitely get this wrong, and I also suspect there's been some foul play with some of the participants of the battle with their accounts, and so I don't blame anyone for getting this wrong, and I'm not saying that my description here is going to be perfect by any means, but I'm going to do my best to piece this all together for you, as well as point out some of the issues, like this first one. A fact that a lot of the sources seem to have missed is that, starting at 1 PM, Lumsden's 1st Armoured Division began a tactical withdrawal. And the sources I have don't specifically say this, but this was most likely done at Lumsden's discretion, under Auchinleck's previous policy of wanting to withdraw. Gott, who was at Freyberg's headquarters, probably had nothing to do with this tactical withdrawal of 1st Armoured Division, although he might have, but either way, British tanks started to fall back at 1 PM. Well, at this moment, Rommel was with the 21st Panzer Division, and although he knew that the 15th Panzer Division was in trouble, he could see that the 21st Panzer and 90th Light Divisions were achieving success. So first, at 1 PM, the same time that 1st Armoured Division started to withdraw, Rommel called the 90th Light Division to congratulate its commander for his rapid advance. He then ordered him to press on and reach the coast before nightfall, saying that the Littorio Division would arrive later in the afternoon to occupy his current position. And at 8 minutes past 1 PM, Rommel ordered the 21st Panzer Division to curve south and around Minqar Qaim to cut off the potential retreat of the New Zealand Division. It was at this moment that Gott left Freyberg's headquarters in a car accompanied by a driver. As he was leaving, the 21st Panzer Division obeyed its orders and moved south to cut off the New Zealand Division, and Gott was not caught in the trap. He managed to get out of harm's way, but he saw this move and believed that this battle had been lost. As Gott himself would later admit, he was tired by this point in his career, having been fighting in the desert since 1940. He'd started off as the commander of the 7th Support Group and 7th Armoured Division, and had risen up the ranks, perhaps too rapidly, to command 13th Corps. His advice to Ritchie regarding the Tobruk defences and his assessment of the situation on both the 26th and 27th of June is evidence of his overall exhaustion as a field commander. And had he and the British commanders not given way, the British may have stopped the Germans at Matruh. But I've got to cut Gott some slack. He didn't know how weak the Germans were at this time. Had this been a full German Panzer Division, then yes, the New Zealanders probably would have been overrun. Of course, we now know that it wasn't a full Panzer Division, but That's with hindsight. Gott wasn't to know this, so his misinterpretation does sort of make sense. It was wrong of him to have just assumed that the division was overrun. He definitely should have double checked, but it's understandable why he came to that conclusion. In reality, 21st Panzer Division only had about 14 or so panzers at this stage, and it actually sent in a hasty assault which was easily repulsed by the New Zealand infantry and artillery. However, the German sources say that at 2 p.m, Rommel's staff intercepted a message indicating that the British were about to withdraw to the east. Again, this was most likely coming from Lumsden, since 1st Armoured Division had started its withdrawal earlier than this and was the only division to fall back at this stage. Well, having had no luck with Gott, at 3 p.m, Freyberg asked 1st Armoured Division directly for tank support. Lumsden was commanding his troops, and so his General Staff Officer, Lieutenant Colonel Peake, told Freyberg that the tanks were in a process of independently withdrawing, further evidence that it was Lumsden or his staff ordering the withdrawal at this stage, and Freyberg was furious. He believed that his division was being abandoned once more, just like at Sidi Rezai. But Lieutenant Colonel Peake said that they would send help. At 4:15 p.m, he told the 22nd Armoured Brigade that the New Zealanders were being attacked and that they needed assistance. 22nd Armoured Brigade sent one tank battalion, the 3rd Country of London Yeomanry, to engage 21st Panzer Division. Unfortunately, the New Zealand transport vehicles were between them and the 21st Panzer Division, and the approaching tanks were mistaken for German panzers and were fired at by the New Zealand artillery, knocking out one of the British tanks. But just then, the Bays Battalion, which was new to the battlefield and was assigned to the 22nd Armoured Brigade, rolled up from the east and forced the 21st Panzer Division to defend itself. And since they were so weak, the Germans had to stop attacking the New Zealanders to deal with this new threat. The Germans reported that they were being engaged by 35 tanks, which almost split their division in two. They gathered every gun they could and managed to hold on, but they were isolated, and had the British pressed their advantage, they still had a grand total of about 140 tanks at this stage, the 21st Panzer Division could have been destroyed, especially since, at 4 p.m, the 90th Light Division set off towards the coast as planned. This move took a sizable number of German troops away from the main part of the battle and left the 21st Panzer Division completely isolated. Freyberg was concerned that the armour was in a process of withdrawal and lacked further information from 13th Corps. In hindsight, this situation wasn't too serious, considering the weakness of the Axis forces, but of course they didn't realise how weak Rommel was, so Freyberg issued instructions at 4:40 p.m. detailing the plans for a potential retreat. He then left his headquarters to go check on his troops and view the enemy attacks for himself, and it was at 5 p.m. that a shell landed nearby. A splinter from this shell hit him in the neck, causing a deep gash and the 13th war wound for the venerable general.
A piece of shell the size of an egg entered below my left ear and passed through my neck. I had a hole that they passed a piece of gauze through the size of a handkerchief. I believe a photo appeared in the mirror of me after being hit. I believe I look rather sick in it. Well, I felt it. This appears to be the photograph in question. It was taken by Harold Payton, 1919 to 2010. The soldier next to him is likely to be his aide-de-camp, Jack Lester Griffiths, 1912 to 2001.
Freyberg's head may have been wrapped in bandages, but he still continued to support Brigadier Inglis, who now took formal command of the New Zealand Division. It was at this point that a crucial decision was made. Lumsden had already sent the 3rd Yeomanry to Freyberg and was now considering moving his own headquarters next to the New Zealanders so that they could cooperate further. But then, at 5 minutes to 5, he received a message from, he believed it was General Gott.
I thought I would move back close because I was still 6 miles away from the New Zealanders, in case anything came to attack them from the other side. Half an hour afterwards, I got a message from Corps Command to say, "It's all over. The New Zealand Division doesn't exist. But the message recorded by the 1st Armoured Division said something a bit different, and I need to point out here that we're not sure who actually sent this order. Lumsden said it was Gott, but Playfair, the British official historian, says that the message was garbled and that it wasn't clear who sent it at the time, so Lumsden may have later said it was Gott even though it could have been someone else. For now, I'm going to assume it was Gott, but remember, there's a possibility that it wasn't him. As far as I can see, New Zealand Division has fallen out of the bedstead. I advise you to iodine as soon as possible at your discretion. The code words bedstead and iodine meant withdraw for the New Zealand and 1st Armoured Divisions. So Gott was saying here that he believed the New Zealand Division was already in the process of withdrawal and that Lumsden should withdraw at his discretion. But Lumsden interpreted the message as the battle was all over and that the New Zealand Division did not exist.
Gott, if it was him, had meant that the New Zealanders were either pushed out of Minqar Qaim or had withdrawn. But Lumsden, supposedly, misinterpreted the message and thought it meant that they had been overrun. However, considering that the 1st Armoured Division was fighting alongside the New Zealanders at that moment, it makes zero sense for Lumsden to conclude that the New Zealanders had been destroyed. So something isn't right here. Now, the idea that most of the historians have bought into is that Gott thought the New Zealanders had been overrun. They're basing this on Lumsden's account, which as you can see is questionable. Gott had just been with the New Zealanders moments before, so it simply doesn't make sense that he thought that they were overrun, especially since we have further evidence that he knew they were still alive. Another message was sent to the New Zealand Division itself, supposedly by Gott, ordering it to withdraw at their discretion. The same wording as the order sent to the 1st Armoured Division, suggesting that it was the same person who sent this. So, assuming this was Gott, if he thought that they had been overrun, why would he send this message? If they're dead, he can't order them to withdraw. So this makes Lumsden's account really suspect. And at 6 minutes past 5, the New Zealanders reply to the message asking the 13th Corps, "Shall we join you at the second destination?" Thus, even if he did originally think that they were overrun, Gott would have known at this moment that the New Zealanders were alive.
The question carried in itself an implication that the division was master of its fate and therefore available for an immediate task in the retreat. Moreover, Gott was at Corps headquarters at the time and was aware of the message and the reply. If any doubts remain, they should have been dispelled by the division's message to Corps at 6:30. Have we got any further orders? The answer was no fresh orders. Unless Gott thought he was speaking to ghosts, it looks like he knew that the New Zealand Division was still alive. So this calls into question Lumsden's account, and I'm making a big song and dance about this because, as I say, I'm going against most of the sources. They've all bought into Lumsden's idea that Gott was keen on withdrawing. Even some of the best sources say this. General Gott's decision that the battle was lost may well be laid at the door of his characteristic love of wandering about a battlefield virtually alone and careless of his personal safety. His visit to New Zealand headquarters had been at the height of the enemy bombardment, and the conversation with General Freyberg was conducted in a slit trench. It is highly probable that after leaving the New Zealanders, he saw the route of their transport and believed that the division itself was involved. It's interesting that when Rommel wanders the desert and makes bad decisions, he's praised as being a great general, but when Gott does it, it leads to the opposite conclusion. Unfortunately for the New Zealanders and for British fortunes as a whole, the move by 21st Panzer Division was seen by Gott characteristically patrolling the battlefield alone for his driver and interpreted by him as the overrunning of the entire division. Was it?
We have evidence from the time showing that Gott knew that the division still existed. So Gott wasn't ordering the withdrawal because he thought the New Zealanders were overrun. He was issuing the withdrawal for another reason. And we know what that reason is. Gott had been told by Auchinleck that they were going to retreat to Alamein if the Germans attacked. So when the New Zealanders got surrounded, Gott could see that the battle was going badly and therefore ordered the 1st Armoured and 2nd New Zealand Divisions to withdraw. He probably knew that Auchinleck would sanction this, which he did, since that was the plan anyway. Yes, Gott did intercept a New Zealand supply convoy and turned it away, which is given as further evidence that he believed that the New Zealand division was destroyed. The idea being that he saw the New Zealanders get destroyed, therefore he stopped the supply column. But is this really the case? He knew the New Zealand division was cut off, so he also knew the supply convoy wouldn't have gotten through to them. The 21st Panzer Division was in the way, so Gott was right to stop the convoy before it drove itself into the German prisoner of war camps. So it's obvious why Gott was so keen on withdrawing.
At the same time as these orders were given, Gott reported to 8th Army that he had given permission to the New Zealand and 1st Armoured Divisions to withdraw, that he was attempting to carry out Pike. Pike is Auchinleck's withdrawal order, so the reason Gott was issuing the order to retreat had nothing to do with the mistaken belief that the New Zealanders had been overrun. The evidence suggests that Gott thought the division was surrounded, not destroyed, which is why he was in contact with them and issued the order to retreat. He was issuing that order because of Auchinleck. Either Lumsden misinterpreted the order to mean that Gott thought that the New Zealanders had been overrun, and that's why his account says what it says, or Lumsden, who was later sacked by Montgomery, is covering for Auchinleck here by trying to pin the blame on Gott, when Gott was just trying to fulfill Auchinleck's order. Gott couldn't defend himself because he was unavailable when the actual official inquiry into this battle was conducted, and we've seen Auchinleck attempt to pin the blame on others like Ritchie before, so it seems likely that this was the case here too. Either way, someone gave the order to withdraw, and the 1st Armoured Division began to fall back to one of the fuel dumps, leaving the New Zealanders to their fate. At this moment, the New Zealanders only had 35 rounds left per artillery gun, and long-term resistance without supplies was simply not possible, so they started to plan their retreat as Rommel sought to strengthen his position. Rommel issued orders at 1722 that 21st Panzer should stand by in the late evening to pursue the enemy in the direction of Censorship Town. All this shows that Rommel had a complete contempt for the enemy and no idea of the perils of his position. The fact was that the 21st Panzer Division was just as isolated, just as surrounded as the New Zealanders were, since they weren't in touch with either 15th Panzer Division nor the Italians to the north. And Rommel still didn't know that the 2nd New Zealand Division was where it was. The 21st Panzer Division knew it couldn't hold the New Zealanders and strike east at the same time, so they informed Rommel that they couldn't do what he wanted. They had 14 panzers and around 600 grenadiers, and so splitting this force would have resulted in disaster, especially if the British had realised how weak they actually were. But the 90th Light Division, with perhaps 1,600 men, reached the coast road at 7:30 PM, isolating the British 10th Corps at Matruh. And it's worth noting that 90th Light Division was also 10 to 15 miles away from the nearest unit, which was the Littorio Division. While the other Italian units were plugging the gaps, the British 10th Corps did have 5 infantry brigades and tons of artillery at their disposal, easily enough to defeat the isolated German unit without any trouble. Still, what Rommel had achieved was noteworthy. Amazingly, in the span of about 5 hours, Rommel's weak Panzer Army Africa had isolated the bulk of the 8th Army and the remainder was in retreat. And that retreat had started 10 minutes earlier at 7:20.
Now again, the historians say that Gott issued the order to begin the withdrawal and could do this because he had permission from Auchinleck to withdraw if he felt it necessary. The historians also say that Auchinleck was disappointed that the withdrawal was even happening. Even though Auchinleck had wanted to withdraw, had encouraged his commanders to withdraw, and had issued the instructions to withdraw, he now supposedly thought that the Axis divisions were isolated from each other and could be beaten. But then instead of ordering Gott to stand firm, he just went along with Gott's intentions, rubber-stamping Gott's decision by issuing the Pike Order for the withdrawal. To me, the narrative doesn't make sense. In the event that this was the way it happened, Auchinleck must take the blame for constantly changing his orders back and forth and confusing his commanders. So regardless of what exactly happened, Auchinleck is at fault here. But I also propose a much simpler solution to all of this. It was Auchinleck who issued the withdrawal orders. Lumsden's account is suspect, so let's just put that aside for the moment. Let's suppose that Auchinleck issued the orders for the tactical withdrawals. Gott carried them through by informing the division commanders, and only later did Auchinleck issue the Pike Order once it was obvious that everything was going wrong. That would cut through all the nonsense and it would straighten up everything else. As explained, it doesn't make sense for the garbled messages to come from Gott, since he knew that the New Zealanders were still alive. Auchinleck was, supposedly, just sat on his hands all day doing nothing and was out of communication with everybody. More likely, he was intervening, and so it's likely that the garbled messages came from the 8th Army. And if all this is the case, we don't then have this Auchinleck had changed his mind thing. So, to me, it seems that all this stuff about Gott starting the withdrawal was a later narrative added into the record in order to excuse Auchinleck for his failures. If this was the case, then unfortunately Gott was blamed for Mersa Matruh, just like Ritchie was blamed for Gazala and Tobruk.
Gott did not have to withdraw. What he should have done was to bring his Corps HQ up to near the New Zealand and the 1st Armoured Division headquarters and command his corps.
Obviously, with the sources in such a mess, it's not possible for me to say this for certain. But I wanted to throw this possibility out there as a potential solution to the contradictions inherent within the narrative. And regardless whether Auchinleck was directly involved or not, he was the army commander and did absolutely nothing to stop Gott from retreating. So Auchinleck must take the blame for not having control of what happened. But anyway, the retreat was on. Brigadier Inglis suggested to Lumsden that their two divisions should cooperate together in the withdrawal. But Lumsden refused, saying that his division was withdrawing to a different location. He did agree to take one New Zealand battalion under his wing, but otherwise offered no help, so Brigadier Inglis had no choice but to do his own thing.
Like General Freyberg, Brigadier Inglis believed it was high time the Germans received some discouraging punishment. They were at their thickest immediately east of 4th Brigade. A blow there would do them most harm and could be inflicted without jeopardising the division's move.
It was only at 8:15 PM that Bismarck, commander of the 21st Panzer Division, informed the Afrika Korps that he was facing New Zealander troops, having only learnt this fact about half an hour before. General Holmes, who had been out of touch with 8th Army's command since 7:30 PM, had by this point realised that something had gone wrong in 13th Corps sector, and he was organising attacks with his forces. He didn't know at this stage that Gott was retreating, and hadn't received the Pike Order from Auchinleck, so his planned counterattacks went in that evening. The 5th Indian Brigade struck towards Sidi Hamza, while the 69th and 151st Infantry Brigades moved towards Minqar Qaim, trying to link up with the New Zealanders. While one battalion from the 5th Indian Brigade did make it to the southern escarpment, the rest either encountered stiff resistance or achieved little in the darkness, and all the troops ended up back where they had started by the morning.
We marched due south in brigade groups, exposing our soft skins to every machine gun and anti-tank gun that cared to fire at us across the moonlit flats. The whole desert seemed to be full of criss-crossing tracer through which we had to march. And then before the moon was down, we had to march back through the hole we had punched so that the enemy, now thoroughly aroused, could have more practice.
Then, at 1:45 AM on the 28th of June 1942, Burroughs' 4th New Zealand Brigade, supported by the 28th Maori Battalion, crept eastwards in the darkness with bayonets fixed, until they were detected and fired at by German sentries. As if this was a starting pistol, by instinct, everyone in the 4th Brigade got up and charged eastwards as one, straight into the heart of the enemy.
A most amazing and thrilling thing happened. To a man, the whole brigade charged forward. No orders were given, no urging forward by officers and non-commissioned officers. With shouting, cheering and war cries, every man broke into a run as if he knew exactly what was expected of him. Using bayonets, rifles, Tommy guns, Brens fired from the hip and the newly issued Bakelite grenade, the 19th and 20th Battalions penetrated into the centre of the closely parked laager. Here, for a few minutes, there was the impassioned drama of war. No chances could be taken, kill or be killed. The bayonet was used with terrifying effect. The German, slumped in the corner of a trench or lying on the ground, might be shamming. He might fire a shot or throw a grenade when backs were turned. A thrust or a bullet eliminated the risk. In the slit trenches, most of the Germans had their boots off, some were undressed, while some Germans attempted to surrender and some to make off by foot and in trucks, others fought hard. Truck drivers used wheeled and half-tracked vehicles as tanks in efforts to overrun the attackers. Some got away, but most fell victim to bullet and bombs, including the sticky grenade.
Brigadier Inglis had deliberately decided to strike at the heart of the 21st Panzer Division because he thought they were weak, and wanted to do as much damage as he could during this breakout. Well, they did. The New Zealanders smashed through and almost annihilated the 1st Battalion of the 104th Panzer Grenadier Regiment in close quarter combat. The German survivors scarpered into the night, except those that couldn't.
Unfortunately, it would seem that German wounded were also killed in the close, fierce, unrelenting violence which encompasses this most searing of all types of battle. It was not long before the word spread that the Kiwis had committed a war crime, and Goebbels' propaganda hacks were soon calling them gangsters. The Germans would later accuse the New Zealanders of filling themselves full of brandy and fighting like Bolsheviks. Discriminatory action was immediately taken against New Zealanders captured in the battle. They were separated from other prisoners, stripped of their personal possessions, and made to stand in the hot sun for 6 hours without rest. Personal indignities were also heaped on some of them. In subsequent battles on the Alamein line, the Germans fought with an intensity strongly suggestive of a desire to get even with the New Zealanders. The feeling was different from that usually held towards a foe whose fighting qualities are respected. Broadcasts from Berlin referred to the New Zealanders as Freyberg's butchers.
Rommel wasn't happy, but it was later pointed out to him by a captured New Zealand brigadier that the New Zealand troops had attacked at night and wouldn't have known that they were attacking a medical unit until it was too late. In the darkness, confusion, and the fact they were speaking completely different languages, it made sense why it would have happened. Rommel understood that night attacks could go wrong and accepted this explanation, so the matter was dropped for him. And because the 5th Brigade had lost most of its transport in the afternoon, the men had to be packed onto whatever was left. Men held onto the sides of trucks, carriers, gun quads, onto the guns themselves, and the divisional staff and remaining troops also moved with them as they prepared to break out too. Now, because Inglis believed that the Germans were weak, he thought it would be a waste for the 5th Brigade to simply follow the 4th Brigade. This was also probably a bad idea since the enemy would already be more alert than before, and it could potentially lead to more casualties. So Inglis decided to send the 5th Brigade south first, before going east in order to hopefully do as much damage to the Germans as possible. Well, 5th Brigade plus the division's headquarters did go south, bumping into an encampment where there appeared to be something up ahead.
There is something just in front. I am sending a carrier section forward to see what it is. That something was extra shadows in the dark about 80 to 100 yards ahead. Gray's words were hardly spoken when the shadows opened fire to disclose themselves as tanks. In the light of their gun flashes and of a direct hit by one of 18th Battalion's anti-tank guns which fired off its portee, Brigadier Inglis saw a closely packed laager of tanks and trucks. The column had run into 21st Panzer Division's tank laager.
Both sides fired everything they had at each other, but the dozen or so panzers of 21st Panzer Division were parked so tight together that the New Zealanders couldn't physically drive through them, and the situation became critical. It was at this moment that the wounded Freyberg called out from his car.
"By God, another balaclava!" A Spandau German machine gun hit the windows of the general's truck from behind, beside the driver's right ear.
The fighting was so close that Brigadier Kippenberger had his pistol drawn as they were driving, trying to pick out targets in the darkness. But a lot of the panzers fired above the New Zealanders' heads, and so only a handful of trucks got hit, with most managing to slip past the Germans and scarper east. They had gotten away. The Germans recorded their disappointment that their encirclement operation had not been successful, and that the enemy had escaped through the gaps in their lines. The 2nd New Zealand Division continued its drive until the evening of the next day, the 28th, where they reunited at their rendezvous point, south of El Alamein. To the amazement of the New Zealanders themselves, the vast majority of the division had in fact made it back, although they had taken 800 casualties in the past 3 days. General Holmes was out of touch with 8th Army's command until 4:30 am on the 28th of June 1942, at which point he received Auchinleck's pike order to retreat. It was clear though that the men at Matruh would have to remain where they were for another day before they could mount their own withdrawal. Holmes informed the 8th Army of their situation and offered them 3 choices. He could break out along the coast road, break out southward and then turn east, or he could concentrate both divisions together and fight a last stand where they were. Auchinleck replied,
"No question of fighting it out. No time to stage deliberate attack along road for which there is probably no objective. You will slip out tonight with whole force on broad front, turn east on high ground and rally El Dabba. 13th Corps will cover you." The 13th Corps, however, was in no position to do so. General Gott was first told at 3:30 PM that he was to help, but not until 9:30 PM did he receive 8th Army's signal that the breakout was to begin at 9. In the general confusion and uncertainty, no effective help could be arranged by the 13th Corps. The 8th Army thought that Rommel wouldn't press on until the units at Matruh were destroyed, and this made sense since German doctrine said that they should destroy the surrounded units first. That was the whole point in surrounding them. But Rommel didn't conform to the rules. Instead, his panzers advanced towards El Dabba at midday, and the Italians in the 90th Light Division were left to deal with Holmes's corps. At this point, Censorship Town was being held by Scott Cole and Glee Cole, which were the remnants of the 29th Indian Infantry Brigade. The 1st Armoured Division was also on the desert flank, but they hadn't received any petrol or supplies all day and so refused to support the Indians. The 12th Lancers were in front of the 29th Indian Brigade and were meant to have alerted Reed if the Germans attacked, but typically this didn't happen. So when the 21st Panzer Division rolled into the 29th Indian Infantry Brigade, they overwhelmed the small force without too much trouble, although they may have lost a panzer or two because some of the Indian guns ambushed the enemy and fought to the last. But 20 officers and 200 other ranks were captured in the process,
and while a few small groups did escape, the 29th Indian Infantry Brigade had been completely destroyed. The Desert Air Force escaped before the Germans arrived, but yet another British line had been penetrated. The Afrika Korps had made up the ground for their previous delays, although they noted that evening that their supply lines were strained. Meanwhile, the British were busy mining the harbour and destroying the port facilities at Matruh. They also contaminated the water there too. The Italian 21st Corps and the 90th Light Division, supported by 6 captured Stuart tanks, tried to attack Mersa Matruh in the late afternoon, but the British held them back with their artillery, and South African anti-tank gunners took out most of the captured Stuart tanks. I will point out that this means that the Axis tank numbers must have been slightly higher than officially stated. Finally, at 9 PM, the breakout of 10th Corps began. Holmes's columns smashed through the Italian lines in their attempt to reach the first escarpment, mostly succeeding, even if the Germans to the east held on a little more firm. However, once they reached the escarpment at about midnight, they turned east and ran into a host of different Axis patrols, rear service units, and headquarters staff, all of which suddenly found themselves caught up in the battle.
Colonel Menton, commanding one of 90th Light's battle groups, found a British column trying to break out through his own headquarters. In the desperate fighting which followed, the German staff used their revolvers in hand-to-hand encounters, and it was 2 hours before the remnants of the column broke through, leaving a brigadier, 7 officers and 450 others in German hands. Mistaking the British for New Zealanders, Rommel also became involved in the fighting, with his own headquarters soon ringed with burning vehicles. Von Mellenthin was firing his submachine gun at the enemy who broke out through Rommel's own headquarters, and this was too close for comfort, and so Rommel and his staff withdrew to the southeast. Units, both friend and foe, became intermingled, and at other times both sides tried to avoid each other, an issue made worse by the fact that much of the Axis transport were captured British vehicles. Still, despite some gallant efforts, the British columns took serious casualties in this fight, including the loss of many of their artillery, rendering their surviving units combat ineffective. Tracer flew in all directions from a score of flashes of light. AP rushed past our ears or kicked up the sand. The Brens from the carriers on either side clattered and flashed. Bosch rose from the ground and scattered from our path. We ran them down and over. I took pot shots at Huns. My driver was ducked to dashboard level. I glanced at my compass and over the open truck back to my guns. Bullets seemed to pour through the quads or bounce at angles from the wheels. One was aflame. It blazed and men jumped on the next one. The mass came on. The carriers creaked steadily forward, firing burst after burst and magazine after magazine. I was never so excited in my life. British fighters covered the retreat as best they could, lacking a clear bomb line, but then fell back themselves. 5th Indian Division headquarters had to get through enemy patrols, ran into German armoured cars and a team repairing a panzer, but managed to run the gauntlet. Holmes's headquarters also barged through and made it back, dodging enemy columns and positions as it did. The survivors of the 2 divisions raced back to the rear of the El Alamein positions to reform. However, when some of the men of 10th Corps arrived at a censorship town, where they were told that the rest of the army would be, they found that the British lorries they pulled up next to weren't occupied by the British, but by the Germans. 21st Panzer Division were just as surprised as they were, and happily took 1,522 men and 60 officers prisoner over the course of 2 hours. After all this trouble though, General Holmes estimated that about 60% of his men had made it back. 1st Armoured Division did nothing all day, and the 2nd New Zealand Division was busy reorganising at the El Alamein positions. So, with most of the British now gone, the Axis advanced on Matruh, easily taking the town since only a handful of British units remained. One man, Frank Robinson, wanted to fight. I pointed out to him that we should all be killed without advancing the war effort in the least. He cried, actually sobbed, and pleaded with me to fight it out. but fighting was out of the question. So I very carefully crawled out of the trench, stood up, and, trying to look much braver than I felt, walked over to the Germans. It was only a short distance, but it seemed an awful long way to me. One of them saw me. He shouted, "Come on, Tommy! Come on, Tom!" I shouted, "All right, lads, come out." They came out with their hands up. I felt a little ashamed. The Battle of Mersa Matruh, Rommel's most astounding victory, the battle Auchinleck never meant to accept, was over.
The other Axis forces were now poised to advance east, but none of them had been this far east before, and none of them were able to provide much information on the British whereabouts. Indeed, the British themselves weren't sure where all their units were. So the big question now was, did Rommel's forces have the strength to win again at El Alamein? If they could, Egypt and the vitally important Suez Canal were theirs.
Dearest Lou, now the Battle of Mersa Matruh has also been won, and our leading units are only 125 miles from Alexandria. There'll be a few more battles to fight before we reach our goal, but I think the worst is well behind us.
The Germans claim that, in total, 6,000 men were captured at the Battle of Mersa Matruh, along with 40 tanks, which had been left behind for repair. The 1st Armoured Division had started with 60 Grants and 99 other tanks, totalling 159, and there had been a few more tanks in Holmes's 10th Corps. So if we take away the 40 captured tanks, plus account for losses and the extra infantry tanks, they maybe had 110 tanks left. It's hard to say though. British losses weren't catastrophic on the surface, but the formations in the 8th Army were so disorganised and depleted that some of them were no longer suitable for battle, and others had to be withdrawn.
The Battle of Matruh gained for 8th Army at the outside a day and a half for manning and improving the defences on the Alamein line. The price paid was heavy. 10th Indian Division, which had arrived at Matruh in fairly good order, was so shattered that it had to be withdrawn to the delta to refit. Only 3 8-gun battle groups were left of 50th Division. 5th Indian Division's 9th Brigade was available for a small fortress role, but there was little left of the remainder of the division.
Rommel's strength was less, but not too bad considering where they had started. The 21st Panzer Division had lost about 4 panzers overall, with its stated strength at 20. The 15th Panzer Division was down to about 15 panzers. This meant there were 35 German tanks at the end of the battle. However, they then reported that they had 55 panzers left, more than the 44 they had started off with. This was because they had finally got the 15 new Mark IV Specials into action, armed with long-range 75mm guns. The Italians had another 30 tanks, mostly M13s, from the 70 they had started with, for a total of 85 Axis tanks. This is compared to the 114 or possibly 125 tanks that they had started with. 40 88mm guns remained, as well as 44 captured 25-pounder guns out of the 500 guns the Axis had left in total. But the crucial statistic now was that they had very few infantrymen left. There were barely 500 grenadiers in the 2 panzer divisions, and little more than 1,000 men in the 90th Light Division. The Italians were also down to 5,500 infantrymen in total for all their formations, meaning that the Axis only had roughly 7,000 infantrymen overall compared to the roughly 9,100 that they had started the battle with. 7,000 infantrymen is less than one full-strength division should have been. Considering these numbers, the decision to withdraw, be it Gott's or Auchinleck's, was a major factor for why Mersa Matruh was a loss for the British. A board of inquiry, headed by General Maitland Wilson, was set up 10 weeks later in September 1942 to examine the cause of the defeat, and they concluded that 13th Corps just disappeared and left 10th Corps up the pole. Well, as several historians point out, if the British had not retreated but instead launched a proper counterattack, they could have annihilated Rommel's forces. However, because the British command planned for a retreat, failed to coordinate their units during the battle, and then issued the order to retreat, the outcome was inevitable.
Once more, with a greatly inferior force under frequent air attack and operating on a logistics shoestring, Rommel had routed a force superior in numbers of tanks, artillery and infantry. Command in 8th Army had been totally ineffective and practically broke down. I would like to make a comment in general terms upon the cause of the disaster. General Auchinleck was well known as a bad judge of a man, and he assembled round him a bad staff. I was apprehensive during the whole of this period because most of us could see it approaching. The Jock column and brigade group, successful with the Italians, were doomed to end in disaster against the Germans, and these were the cause of our failures. It has been argued that our defeats were due to a lack of a good tank. I do not agree. It could have been offset, and it was in 1943 when the Sherman tank plus the use of artillery saw off the Tiger and the Panther. The new setup of the 8th Army could not work. You could not combine the duties of Commander-in-Chief Middle East with command of an army in the desert. The Commander-in-Chief should have put in a new commander who had not lost his nerve. Looking back, seeing the whole picture, many things are now obvious. 1. No success could be achieved if an army commander is allowed to reorganise on the lines of his scheme 27th of June. This was quite fantastic and would ruin any army. 2. Auchinleck was completely out of the picture. 8th Army Operation Instruction No. 83 of 26 June showed a lack of understanding of what had happened. The army had, for the moment, disintegrated. The system of command had broken down. Neither Holmes nor Gott made any effort to keep their front intact. The 21st Panzer Division found a hole and went right through between 10th and 13th Corps. When this happened, instead of attacking to close the hole, the Commander-in-Chief issued the order to withdraw. 3. A study of the frequent change of plan shows that Auchinleck was badly served on the G side. General Corbett, Chief of Staff to Commander-in-Chief Middle East, and Dorman Smith, Deputy Chief General Staff Middle East, were bad choices. Ritchie was also badly served. Brigadier Walsh, Brigadier General Staff of 10th Corps, was good. In his notes he said that on one day, I think about the 23rd or 24th of June, his corps got 3 separate sets of orders, all of them altering the policy of defence. What was wanted at Mersa Matruh was for 10th Corps to start to get out early on 26th of June, and, if necessary, we should have fought an army battle with the massed artillery of the 2 corps side by side in a physical touch, with the army commander well forward. It must be pointed out, though, that the British did remain mobile, and did manage to slip away. Their forces were depleted, but large numbers of them had survived, including the important New Zealand Division, which Rommel himself praised as being among the elite of the British Army. Had the British decided to stand and fight, and then drop the ball like they had at Gazala, then it's likely that the First Battle of El Alamein wouldn't have gone so well. So it has been argued that the British retreat at Matruh saved the North African campaign. I think that, given the state of British forces at Matruh, a retreat to El Alamein was actually the right thing to do. However, they could have also chosen to stand and fight if they wanted. It's an either-or decision. The problem at Matruh was that the British command was so muddled that they kept going back and forth on this decision. At first, Ritchie wanted to stand at the border, then he said they'd retreat to Matruh, then he decided to stand at Matruh until he got sacked the night before, at which point Auchinleck said they were going to retreat, but only said this on the morning of the first day of the battle itself. The confusion between this back and forth between standing and withdrawing really just didn't help the situation and made the Battle of Matruh a foregone conclusion.
So, in terms of the British perspective, I think this was the decisive factor. But I would also argue that Rommel's determined leadership fooled the British into thinking that he was stronger than he actually was. Leading from the front, his drive and energy persuaded the British to start the withdrawal in the first place, which then led to their defeat. So it wasn't so much tactics as it was just simply Rommel's personality that led to the British scarpering and handing him the victory. But what do you think? Let me know in the comments below. In the next Battlestorm video, we'll be covering the First Battle of El Alamein, so if you haven't subscribed, be sure to do so now. Check out my other videos in the meantime, and thanks for watching and supporting. Bye for now.